Hello and welcome to a conversation about lesbian culture with Judy Grahn, Max Dashu, and Bonnie Morris. We're excited to present these three lesbian scholars steeped in lesbian culture and gathered here for all of our and their own enjoyment. I'm Jenny Lamorgan, owner of greenlesbian.com, where you can shop and browse books and DVDs by these women and lots of other lesbian-created art, culture, and the necessities of our lives. Let me tell you a little bit about each of our guests. Professor Judy Grahn is a poet, activist, and scholar. She is one of the founding mothers of the lesbian, feminist, and women's spirituality movements in the United States. Judy initiated and participated in profound cultural shifts brought about by the women's and gay rights movements of the 1960s and 70s. She participated in not just the formation of new institutions like the Women's Press Collective, the Oakland Feminist Women's Health Center, and a Women's Place Bookstore, but also the creation of whole new ways of living, including collective feminist households that cut through the political and social isolation women experience. Judy's latest book is A Simple Revolution, published by Aunt Loot. Her other books include The Judy Grahn Reader, Blood, Bread, and Roses, How Menstruation Created the World, and Another Mother Tongue, Gay Words, Gay Worlds, and of course several books of poetry. Most recently, Judy is teaching writing workshops, doing readings, and working on new projects. Her next book is Hanging on Our Own Bones, a collection of her 9-part poems due out from Red Hen Press this fall. Our next guest is Bonnie J. Morris. Bonnie is a women's studies professor and historian, recently completing 22 years on the faculty of both Georgetown and George Washington University, and accruing multiple teaching awards from both institutions for her popular courses in women's study and women's history and lesbian culture. She is the author of 15 books, including 3 Lambda literary finalists, Eden Built by Eve, Girl Real, and Revenge of the Women's Studies Professor. She authored 2 National First Prize chapbooks, The Schoolgirls Atlas and Sixes and Sevens. And she authored the critical feminist texts, Women's History for Beginners, and most recently, The Disappearing Owl. Bonnie's recent exhibit on women's music at the Library of Congress broke new ground in showcasing lesbian albums, and she is now a historical consultant to the Smithsonian Institute, the AP U.S. History Exam, Disney Animation, the State Department's International Visitor Program, and the Global Women's Institute. She may be found lecturing on C-SPAN, Olivia Cruises, Semester at Sea, and on Pacifica Radio. This summer, Dr. Bonn is excited to introduce a new lesbian time travel novel, Sappho's Bar and Grill, which includes a brief look at the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League of World War II. Our third participant, who will be facilitating this conversation and joining in, is scholar, artist, and historian Max Dashu. Max founded the Suppressed Histories Archives in 1970 to document global women's history and to track patterns of domination and the experiences of women in the full spectrum of world cultures. Max is internationally known for her expertise on ancient female iconography, patriarchal systems, including witch hunts and female spheres of power. She has produced 2 videos, Woman Shaman in 2013 and Women's Power in Global Perspective in 2008. Her book, Witches and Pagans, Women in European Folk Culture, was published in 2016 by Valeda Press. Max Dashu's work is followed by 156,000 readers on Facebook and thousands more on academia.edu. Now I'll turn the mic over to Max and let the conversation begin.
Thank you, Jenny Lamorgan. Well, I'm so honored to be here. The 2 of you, Judy Grahn and Bonnie Morris, represent such an impressive spread of lesbian culture and activism and networks. Judy, in your case, we see working-class lesbians poetry and literature, the explosion of women's bookstores, feminist printers and publishers, and a whole diverse network of lesbian activists. And Bonnie, you interweave all of this, particularly the bookstores and their communities, with women's music, feminist bands, festivals, workshops, producers, and comedians. And together, reading these two books, I should really name them, A Simple Revolution, The Making of an Activist Poet, and The Disappearing L, Erasure of Lesbian Spaces and Culture. Each of these, reading them, present such a wealth of information that it just astonished me, not because I'm not familiar with with this world, but by the very fact of seeing its significance being recorded and given recognition in a concentrated way, showing the connections and the through lines. And the gap that where we don't see this very often, this continuity and this density, demonstrates the degree of cultural exclusion and oblivion to which lesbians are subjected. So I want to begin by asking both of you, I have several questions along this line. What is lesbian culture? What is distinctive about it? Go.
What is it? Go ahead, Bonnie.
Well, kind of a large question there. I would say it is an awareness of identity that brings like-minded women together. It is recognizable across time, even if the women went by different names. It is very specific to woman loving and being aware you're not likely to be married to a man, and your social preference is also with other women and women's minds. You can be a lesbian and be immersed in lesbian culture even if you don't have a lover. It's much more than sex. I find in my journals from my 20s and 30s, I constantly come back to the idea of a specific kind of lesbian intelligence, which I definitely named dyke intelligence at the time. And I think it's being part of an outsider group that has very different institutions, spaces, material culture, fashion, music, and energy than is found anywhere in the mainstream, although a big part of lesbian culture has always been trying to gain acceptance and sometimes even power in the mainstream.
Yeah. Judy, do you have anything to add to that?
That's beautiful. Yes, I would add that there's some kind of core of women-centeredness that is carried just inherently in lesbianism, and it overlaps with dykeness too, but for lesbianism, it's a way of women bonding together and having solidarity that isn't found anywhere else for the reasons that Bonnie has said. And I think that it's inherent in culture all the way through, all the time, everywhere. But it pops up at times when there is a particular social need, when there's a women's movement in particular, then it surfaces. And when it does, it opens up these things that I call portals for women as a whole to engage differently with culture than they had been before that. So that's something that I believe, not only from my own experience with watching lesbian feminism develop as a separatist enterprise that saw itself as doing this strategically, not as a lifelong thing necessarily, but as a strategy for social change. But also I've just have had people talk to me about historic occasions that it seems to have happened before. And so I would add that.
Okay.
I think there's also a survival skill aspect. I was thinking about this last night, looking over, Max, your excellent questions and thoughts. And I found myself reflecting on how up until incredibly recently, when there were absolutely no civil rights or protections or, police protections or anything like that, part of lesbian culture was the skill set you had for survival, for living outside the law, being ready to defend the possibility of being attacked, how you articulated your life position to family members, to clergy, what level of preparedness did you have to come out and defend your life, and how often did you tap into those resources? And that's a whole different set of cultural know-how from just looking for, an entertaining night with like-minded gals in a bar. And I think that that's something that really needs to be clarified more as we try to explain to the, next generations exactly what it was like to claim an identity in an era when it was a crime, frankly, to live illegally, even if you had, as so many of us did or do, a great deal to contribute to, your country or your ethnic group or whatever it might be.
That's true, because not only the anti-sodomy laws, but and the legally defined sense of a crime, but the whole aspect of women without men in a patriarchal society.
Yeah, I think that, people joke about the snobbery of lesbians who claim I'm a gold star lesbian, I've never been with a man, and that's a certain kind of authenticity test. But I would also say that, across cultures, part of lesbian culture is recognizing one another when you don't even speak the same language. And I remember being called out, on a back alley street in Morocco by a woman who clearly was some kind of drug dealer or nefarious person, but who recognized me and actually yelled out in English, "Hey, sister," and I did stop and I did have tea with her, and nothing was really explained. She was a woman in, tracksuit pants surrounded by women in veils and dresses, but she said, "I know a place where you can have tea and no man will bother you, and I will take you there because just seeing you saves my life." This conversation happened in Casablanca in 1993, and I never forgot it because it was a great validation for someone like me who doesn't look, butch and would not normally be picked out as the big homo in the crowd. That was a great moment of sisterhood in a completely different continent.
That's a great story. That's marvelous. And yes, there is certainly that, and I think that overlaps with gay people as a whole also, that there are recognitions, there are signals that people pick up on and recognize each other and have an understanding of just what we all really are up against. And this is something that I think that, Max, one of your questions, what did I learn from doing a simple revolution, which made me think about that I had, when you write a book, you back your camera up and you take some kind of a pan shot to take a look at what is the map of where I've been, what did it look like. And my history with all of it started in the 1960s, after I was thrown out of the Air Force for being a lesbian, and that radicalized me, and I went then to a psychiatrist who wanted to change me into a heterosexual person. because he thought that what was wrong with me was that men didn't want me. If you can imagine how that's all twisted around. So then after a year, I decided I would rather be insane, if that was the definition, that I would be insanely homosexual and proceed with the destiny of my life. But in backing my camera up, I could see. Then I got involved with Mattachine Society, which was created by the marvelous madman and very colorful communist Harry Hay.
Yeah.
And picketed the White House along with Frank Kameny and other members of Washington Mattachine, and I met Barbara Giddings at that time. And they were very, very political, and psychiatry was one of the places that they understood there was a lot of oppression. So what I learned was that there's these four pillars of oppression that surround gayness and by extension lesbianism, and this is not counting everything that also happens to us as women, of the entire patriarchy. But these four particular things were that I learned from doing the book were this remembering about the psychiatric, remembering that the military and the police were always there to criminalize or otherwise harass, and then the church and religion that teach hatred of us, and then finally, and perhaps most shockingly, the Marxist, Leninist, and Maoist left, which is the place of change in America itself. So the very place of changing has written into its documents a distrust of homosexuality.
A pathologizing, really.
Yes, a pathologizing of that as lumpen proletariat and as a decadent product of capitalism and so on. And I'm realizing that our movement, and by our movement, I'm talking about two movements, the gay movement, but also the lesbian feminist movement that I helped to found with Gay Women's Liberation in 1959 with 6 other dykes that we met up at a gay conference. And we said, let's just separate from everybody. and that's what we did. We separated from absolutely everyone, including the straight women's movement that was just fledgling at that time. But we addressed every single one of those. Those continue to be what needs to be addressed, in my opinion, in addition to an understanding of the monolithic patriarchy. These are some of the elements that particularly aim themselves at suppressing lesbianism, and they do it because of the power that we have, because they know that we have a seductive power that bonds women, and the separation of women is one of the exercises of the patriarchy, to make women be rivals for men's attention. And we cut through that in some rather amazing ways with this movement.
I also feel
yes, we did.
Yeah, the aspect of being ignored historically, is a pillar that's germane to our discussion today. That you would be, in my case, a literate kid, and you go looking for who you are in books, and there's lots of subtle references, but not any kind of, explicit, here's your history, kid, start studying. And my friends and I in grad school were in a very good women's history doctoral program, but we did all of the research about our own lives on the side. It was not well integrated in the classroom. We did not get a good overview of lesbian history per se. We read voraciously everything that was being produced, including Judy's work, because we were aware of independent lesbian presses, and we had access by, I'm talking like the early 80s, to women's bookstores. You went on a road trip and you bought everything you could afford on your little grad stipend, that was specific to lesbian literature, erotic, historical, intellectual, humorous, science fiction, whatever was beyond Harriet the Spy, which I started with. And then it occurred to me about midway through grad school that if I wasn't finding the documentation of my own culture that I craved, I was going to have to do it myself. And there's a whole lot of different theorists, including Gerda Lerner and all of you, who, you know, make note of the fact that in every generation, female activists believe that they're starting from scratch, that they're doing the work for the first time, that they don't know who did that work before them, and then eventually they might have a breakthrough and realize there's a whole lineage of other people who wanted to make change. But, you know, I saw with gratitude that there was a whole lot of lesbian literature, poetry, theory, lots of very crisp separatist writing, a lot of political writing, but nobody seemed to be writing about what everyone was doing in their spare time, which was going to women's music festivals and concerts and, you know, making love to a Holly Near album. And I thought, well, that's so interwoven in the lives of the households I visit. I'll take over that area and write about what's going on with that aspect of the culture. So I think everybody picks their subject matter, and I feel like we're all working unpaid all the time as lifelong laborers in adding to the giant sort of bibliography, the Bibliothèque Lesbiana, you know?
The term in the 70s was cultural worker.
Yeah.
We're cultural workers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that was part, I mean, I really resonated with what you said about opening up portals, Judy, because, you know, there are moments where things burst through. And, you know, even just what you were saying about gay women's liberation in 1969. 1969 was such a portal year. I mean, what was going on in the world alone already was a lot about that. But a lot of us were going through ruptures with what were supposed to be liberatory undertakings like the New Left or whatever, you know, the way that the women's movement exploded out of the civil rights movement and exploded out of the New Left. I mean, some of the horror stories about, you know, take her off the stage and bleep her, you know, just the huge degree of misogyny that we were reacting to. I want to say something. I would really get you to both address that, and particularly you, Judy, because of the time factor. I think we're like 10 years apart from each other. we got 50s, 60s, and 70s here. What was the context? I don't think people understand the misogyny and the sexist context that led to the impetus for separatism, or what we then called the autonomous women's movement.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that we had to be self-determining because we had spent so much time hectoring and arguing and debating and, you know, just on and on trying to convince men to listen to us and that these issues were important, and being either ridiculed or just outright silenced and dismissed. You know, just there was this deep-seated resistance that the struggle against oppression on the basis of sex meant anything, had any reality, and people, you know, they were talking about bourgeois feminism and all that. So let's address that, the reason for the autonomous women's movement.
It took me a long time to understand that everything that was affecting my life was affecting every other woman's life as well. That women as a whole, when we say it was second-class citizens, we're talking about the fact that women couldn't get credit. You know, they had difficulty owning property or getting hands on property. Keeping their children in the case of a divorce, being excluded from communities if they had the slightest little sexual indiscretion. We were called girls, interrupted as a matter of course, not listened to. And the left in particular, not to single it out, everyone had this opinion, but it was the idea that men, as soldiers and as people who go out and tough it out with each other and make the money, are the wounded warriors, and they should get all the credit, and that women somehow were lolling about, eating lollipops and reading
or the auxiliary.
Yeah.
When in actuality, women were in the workforce already and wanted to advance in that workforce, and they wanted, the women who were at home wanted into the workforce. When women had been excluded so much from education, they would go and try to get an education, and everything is men, and your questions are overlooked in the classroom, and then, the head of the department, in my case, wants you to come in at 9 o'clock at night and somehow help them with the filing, which is just nothing in the world but a blatant thing of, we'll pass you, but only if you have sex with us.
Sexual harassment was rampant at that time.
Absolutely.
It was rampant still when I was in grad school. We had a couple of very, very star students who experienced harassment by a male professor, and we were appalled at how reluctant the so-called progressive family were to get him out of there. We had meeting after meeting, and the intimidation of the students who wanted to make a complaint was so much that in the end very few were willing to commit to, going forward with a formal complaint. And he was just moved around the country, from job to job, hitting on grad students wherever. And boy, so that is, I think, something that is what is recognized now in terms of college sexual harassment or campus codes will make some kind of statement. But I don't think people really understand the degree to which that interrupted and ended women's academic ambitions.
Yes, and that and the extent to which women have to always bond together and fight against and fight for autonomy of their own bodies. Or it simply becomes taken for granted that the purpose, notice this sentence, the purpose of women is to sexually serve men. And that is just so ugly, just even the whole idea of it. And it has to be fought against. I can remember a poster that I wish I had a copy of that was about the discovery of the clitoris. And it had to do with women's total autonomy, to have an autonomous body that has orgasms, it has the right to have orgasms, it knows how to have orgasms, and that sexual partners need to take that into account and it's not just pleasure, it's not just about pleasure in any sense of a decadent pleasure, that pleasure is a decadent thing. It is not even about that. It is about expressing your entire self and having autonomy as a person, as a body on this earth, as a being.
Inhabiting your body, right?
Inhabiting your body, yes, as your body and your rights over it. Including all the reproductive pieces. That has to be fought for again and again. And one of the things about early lesbian feminism is that we understood that right away. So we were right away dyke warriors in behalf of women. And while it isn't true that I started a health center, I certainly was part of the very tight group of dykes who did. We had a bookstore. There was a group that had the health center very bravely, and we had the press and other things. Self-defense was one of the first things that a dyke who knew how to teach it was teaching it to everybody. And it all toward this idea of the autonomy of the female body and, of course, the autonomy of the female mind as well.
Yeah, the colonized mind.
Yes.
Which is one reason why cultural feminism arose, because we knew that it wasn't just a question of changing laws or even just the economic changes, there's all these physical things that people think about with movements, but for women and for lesbians especially, because women without men, you really just have to fight such a huge backlog, this embedded wall of cultural attitudes that, try to disassemble you at any contact point, whether it's religion, sexuality, walking down the street, going to school, all of these things. And I think that the awareness of, the fact that culture, that diseased culture, toxic patriarchal culture, had everything to do with what we were going through.
I think that there's a real difference now where you have kids, who are, coming out at age 12 or whatever, and who are demanding recognition, support, and services, in their middle school, which I certainly applaud, but would never have occurred to me to request. I think part of the growing up, coming out into lesbian culture that was experienced previously was not just understanding you were going to live as an outlaw, but understanding at an early age you were going to live without a husband's income, and that you were likely to be less affluent, or you would have to find a profession that accommodated the fact you weren't willing to compromise in certain ways, and you didn't necessarily plan on what is today called marriage, so you might not have a partner with a better income. A lot of it was about understanding you were going to be an autonomous person economically. And that layer, is still very much part of my thinking and operating in life. And then there's all the sort of intimate details of living as a lesbian, title, of many good books and albums. And I love the idea that women set up in their households, altars to goddesses or spaces that are very specific to foremothers or matriarchy. And it's subtle, but it's a reminder of, deliberately creating an environment that is all about female energy. And everything, my friends and I did, from the posters on the wall to the music and, the food you had in the fridge, was very thoughtful about constructing, at least in your home, the world you wanted to live in. And you really could feel that you were part of a network of households that had that same ethos, which made visiting one another all the more pleasurable.
Right, and you're really talking about women setting about establishing for ourselves a lineage. One of the things that women's spirituality groups so frequently do is ask everyone to name their mothers, grandmothers, and so on, going back with the female line as far as they possibly can. And I'm reminded that in the Bible, but also in all kinds of records, in all kinds of countries, women are not recorded except as wives, except as a first name, or perhaps not even recorded at all, and not if they are not attached to a male family. They may not even be in the social records of ever having existed in that culture. Whereas the Bible has this model for men of the list of begats, of who begat who, meaning that the men taught themselves how to do this, and they know how to do this. They know how to credit their own historians, and they do that. They, I think, created footnotes so that they could do a patrilineage that made sense to them and keeps their ideas in place. And so women need to learn to do this, and that's what you're talking about is some of the methods that we've been developing that help to put that sense of a lineage and of belonging to a female power line in place. And the question is now, how do we hold it in place? And that's for the generations to do, right?
You have to feel like you matter. You have to take yourself seriously. I think there was an extraordinary sort of gene pool of cultural workers, obviously, the two of you, but many, many other, role models for me. I had just an astounding good fortune, to come out when I was still a teenager, and there were all of these institutions and books and recorded lyrics in place that said, yes, you are a human being. But yes, there are others like you. And in my case, I was very hungry to bond not just with lesbians, but with smart lesbians. I was very specific. Where are the brainy dykes? How can we all get together and party and talk? And my quest was very much about how did a particular cohort of women understand that it was acceptable to take yourself seriously enough to write your life stories down? Who were the women who avoided being beaten down or feeling shamed or silenced, not just surviving, but thriving and wanting to, create a sort of living scrapbook of their own lives and excitedly pass it around? That, I thought, required an amazing amount of confidence. And in my case, I was able to be a confident, cheerful baby dyke because I had very loving and supportive parents who never had any kind of criticism or shaming or moral problem with anything I did. And others were not so fortunate. And I think the idea that you understand you matter enough to have a past and a future, for a lot of folks, there was a drive. Some of the women I've talked to, we agree, we just feel driven. If we have the comfort zone to love ourselves and have the support of our family members, then we have to do twice as much cultural work for the women who are still silenced and beaten down and oppressed or hurt or wounded by their immediate family. And I felt like I had an almost holy obligation to write everything down and record the moment, which could end at any time, and, stay up late and work for no pay and, whatever else the goddess asked, and that was sort of my mission here on planet Earth. And anything else I did that was for a regular income, okay, great. But everything that was a priority should be toward this end of documenting what it was like to be in this particular time. And then because things changed so much in the 21st century, I've increasingly been pretty comfortable saying, yeah, I really wanted to record what it was like to be a lesbian in late 20th century America when there was this massive lesbian cultural movement. And I'm still interested in recording and articulating that particular generation, which has yet to be treated fairly in either history or the media.
I got temporarily disconnected, so I missed part of what you said there, Bonnie. But, what I was going to say about all that is that you've accomplished an amazing documentation of a political and cultural phenomenon that's off the radar of mainstream media and mostly absent on the Internet, as you observe. I mean, reading this really demonstrates to me the cultural and social marginalization of lesbian feminists, and also the structural economic barriers we face in comparison, like, for example, gay men who have much more resources. In the slick magazines or how many bars or all the different venues of culture, it's a lot more difficult for lesbians, A, to build and B, to sustain. And yet there we went ahead and forged a path.
Well, I think you're naming something I feel very strongly about. You're right that with fewer economic, soft landings, what lesbians have as our treasure chest are these cultural spaces and gatherings that are now vanishing. And what's painful is that before they're even accounted for, now that we're allowed to have LGBT history textbooks or whatever, the whole era of women's music festivals and bookstores and so forth went from being invisible to maybe 10 minutes that you could talk about it in a college classroom, and then it's vilified again. There just hasn't been a sustained era where it's permissible to celebrate everything that was accomplished. And what was accomplished, as I said in my book, if you put little lavender push pins on a map of the United States, and you could see that in every city there was a women's bookstore and a women's center, and there was a place where you had women's music concerts, and every state had a women's music festival, even Alaska and Hawaii. And now, we're pulling all those little lavender push pins out, and a person doesn't encounter a historical marker, although the Park Service is trying to change that. And there's no way of claiming, hey, this is our treasure chest. This is what we did with no money and nobody's permission. And trying to explain to some of my students, the best metaphor I've come up with is, this was our Facebook. When you wanted to, find other women and check in with how are you doing, what's going on, who's in trouble politically, or where do we need to focus our energy, those issues came up in the course of evenings at bookstores and concerts, where you might have a planned program of entertainment or a book or an album being introduced, but inevitably whoever was on stage would turn the conversation to what the community needed, and women who came that evening just as consumers of culture left as producers and became activists, and that was the magical transformation. If you had, that collective energy, somebody would come up with a solution to whatever needed to be tackled in the course of an evening because of the interaction that was so precious. And to be in a room with, more than 18 lesbians was so riveting. That's what's lost, I think, now that you can just turn on your computer and instantly connect with homos of the world while still in your pajamas.
It was revolutionary, and it really was an interface between the political, the cultural, the economic. I think of the centrality of lesbian households in the feminist movement, and Judy, you name some of them in your book by their location. Your stronghold at Terrace Street, the feminist socialists at Essex Street. I lived at Ellsworth Street, where most of B.B. Croce's band was there, and the drummer Sandy Ajita.
Cool.
And then the famous Drury Street Dykes. Can you share your insights about what that meant for us in activism, economically, whatever?
These households. That was the second enormous thing that I learned from doing the book when I was trying to figure out how to organize it. It was started out as my own memoir, and then I realized the limitations of just one person's memory, and of course I also realized that at heart we had this sort of I'm not sure what to call it. It's certainly not a centralized socialism, but we had just a kind of a folk, easygoing folk socialism of sharing everything that, of course, I would need to include all of these people that I possibly could who had made this movement happen. So I interviewed a lot of them, and then I said, how am I going to organize this? And I said, well, the obvious. It's geographic. It's we were all in households, and those households mattered so much. Here's why they mattered so much. We were fortunate that rents were cheap at the time, but we also just simply decided to have these households, and because of this sort of diffuse love bond that we were all sharing with each other, we got along enough to hold these households together, and they could incorporate people of a variety of classes and races and backgrounds and skills. So, and also tolerances for whatever messiness was going on, like drunkenness or inability to keep house or, whatever, levels of militancy and that kind of thing. But these households then were able, it was so that someone like me, who had just been always scrabbling for a living, had never had a room of my own, and the Terrace Street household was the moment my lover Wendy and I moved into it, and they said, we've freed up some rooms so you can come in. We were told that every woman was to have a room of her own. This is the piece of Virginia Woolf that we acted out on purpose as a political decision that every single woman would have a room of her own. So couples didn't live together in these rooms. Each of us had our own space. And that meant that our art and the autonomy of our minds and who we were was expected to come to the surface. And then the households themselves became these cauldrons of talent, of people, because when you mix the classes and you mix the races and ethnicities and everything that's separated in the patriarchal, capitalist economy, that's dynamite power.
Yeah.
When it all gets together, when it interfaces with each other. And so we formed these projects that were extensions of the household, and people in the household kept those projects going. That may have been something like a women's carpenter group, or it may have been the bookstore, it may have been the press, or the health center was doing this. There was a newspaper out of one that was, in the city. Others, there was ball teams. Others, there was, as you said, there were the bands. So there was rehearsal space. So it was a claiming of geography, but it was geography with all this potent female power that had not had any chance to interface with each other, coming together. People from the upper class who had been discarded by their families, and people from the lower class who had never had a dime, and so on. It was a very, very rich thing. And so it's more than just a house,
Yeah.
It was really like, I don't know, a city-state or something.
Yeah.
Really like
they're bases. They're like a base, but they're also a nexus. It's like it's got all these aspects.
Yes.
And sometimes, like the first lesbian house I lived in, Berkeley, there was a band, so it was Berkeley Women's Music Collective. Some of those members lived there, but then there was also Gail Grazzi, who was an auto mechanic, and so there were these interrelationships between these nexuses. There was a whole matrix of them, in fact, which were then in turn related to the women's coffee houses, the women's bookstores, or whatever other things got created.
And the one that I always thought I would live in a group house one day, and it just never happened. But what I belonged to was a women's private club, which was also a bar called Horizon in upstate New York, that at one point had like 300 members from 15 surrounding towns around Binghamton, and we had, that sense of a collective. We had a membership and a board, but people who lived in, again, cheap, affordable apartments were able to all come together from very different backgrounds and meet at the club where we planned activities. We had a couple of bands. We had one really dynamic performer, Slim Ryan, who was the head of a group called the Fallopian Tubes, and we did open mic nights and shows and a cafe and camp outs and, you know, went down to see Lily Tomlin on Broadway and so forth. But what I observed immediately when I came into that club, and it was a private club in order to be woman only, and have a bar license. I observed that the most important women in that community were not the most glamorous or rich or, you know, famous or anything like that. It was what kind of skills did you bring to the community? How much could you get done? Could you build the stage and, you know, work a, you know, lighting track or a sound track, you know, and cook and drive people and, you know, play an instrument? And whoever was able to share the most ability and do so without begrudging it and on time and in an organized way made possible the space to continue for everybody else. And in turn, it was pretty well distributed. And we've done a lot of history about the club, and there was a lot of, you know, baloney about was there a hierarchy, was it unfriendly to some, who felt at home there and who felt there was an in-group. But again, my excitement at finding a collective like that was to immediately become a little anthropologist, you know, and sort of take notes on the whole thing, like, hey, isn't this cool? So how does this work? You know, what's going on? Let's take some pictures, you know. And what I love from that era is reflecting on nights when everything just came together and you had, you know, brilliant conversation over pinochle or something. And, you know, people who might characterize the times and spaces of lesbian feminism of being sort of doctrinaire and not sensual, that is so wrong. It was incredibly sexy.
Wrong.
People were constantly in love with one another. There was a great deal of hot romantic energy that ran like a thread through everything.
Yes.
You know, I'm still in love with the people I was in love with then. There's just no way around it. And it still drives my writing life, that feeling of being opened up by people the likes of whom you had never met before.
Yeah,
Right.
you know,
That's right.
it's true, and that I think that what for a lot of lesbians, what happens is that exes become family.
Oh, for sure.
And so we get
Yes,
these
that was
growing
certainly true in my
families.
experience of this, and I love what you're describing, Bonnie, of this erotic energy, which we don't even have a decent name for it, you know. We don't have a name for the life force that infuses everything, that makes the garden just sing, and you know that the flowers are feeling all of this erotic energy, but we don't have a name for it. And so when it's turned loose in a group like this, and it doesn't have to turn into sex, but it can. But it can just stay as this kind of bonding energy, this oxytocin. You know, I don't even have a name for it.
Well, I used to say the vibe, you know. And
yeah, that's a good one.
I used to joke that, you know, when I didn't have a lover, I wrote a book. You know, I would use all of the pining desire, unconsummated energy and pour it into, you know, some other structure. And I think that was what was going on. There were a lot of women pouring energy into let's create alternative structures while we have time. And true enough, a lot of women then did settle down with one another, and, you know, some bought houses and some had kids, and the club dissolved. It became, you know, quote, real households instead of a holding space for women in their 20s and 30s who were devoted to fostering culture. And issue you raised when rents were cheap, boy, is that true, because that has made it very difficult to have spaces that could be maintained whether or not people were in them every night, to have a bar or a bookstore that could have 3 people come by one day and then 30 the next. Just can't be done anymore. So everybody is nostalgic about, wouldn't it be great to have a space like that in the neighborhood? But they don't understand what made it possible for part of the landscape to be a lesbian corner, and that was in some ways possible even though there were, anti-gay laws, because rent was low.
Mhm. Yeah, that's right.
We
so
were
there has to be an economy.
Mhm.
We were economic insurgents.
Economic insurgents.
Carve out a space for ourselves however we could, because we really felt like we were up against an entire society, and we knew that it wasn't welcomed what we were doing, and we were just going to find a way to do it. So collectives was a way to do it. And another way, and this is back to the erotic, is the all-women's dances that we started having in the very early 70s. And that was something that was like, again, a break from what was around us. And Judy, you have a really beautiful passage about this in your memoir. Would you be willing to share it with us, because you say it so well?
Sure. Okay. Let's see.
123.
We've been talking about yes. Well, yes. The first all women's dances were of our movement, my part of the movement in the Bay Area, California. They were held in Berkeley in 1970. And poetry readings were connected to them. Poetry readings were very crucial to them. So Kathy Cade said this about that. She's a photographer and organizer. She said the poets would read, and the poetry somehow united us as a community, and then we would all dance together. Women-only dances were happening in New York and Boston and other places. But there was a communal erotic beat that took hold of us, and we began to dance with whoever was there, not as a flirtatious arrangement, but as a soaking up and spreading of a new exhilarating vibrational rate. The guarded quality of our life fell away for a while, and we saw each other anew. In that first rush of sexual solidarity, we saw each other as a group of warriors. Gay women's liberation, handsome warriors. We saw each other, and we liked what we saw. Having been told so often, so many ways, how ugly we lesbians were, how plain, how old-maidish, how no man would want you, how criminal, unwomanly, undesirable, dishonorable, disorderly, filthy, man-hating, whorish, inhuman, insanely jealous, and just yucky we were in our very existence, we were astonished to discover our collective beauty. I was not the only one to experience ecstatic exuberance and all-encompassing, heart-opening desire at the women's dances, to feel again, as I had at earlier times, but never this strongly, swept up in a river of sheer beauty, sexy, powerful, gorgeous, clit distending, nipple-raising, lip-swelling, hair-shaking, spit-flowing, cunt-glowing, eye-flashing, hip-rotating, knee-twisting, thigh-pumping, pheromone-coursing, fingers expressing, sultry, spicy, sweat-smelling, complexly exhilarating female potentiality. We raised up storms of change with our dancing, not because we were dancing, but because our dancing celebrated our commitment to each other. Aesthetics begins with erotic love, and now because we had a viable movement, we had an aesthetic. We had beauty and courage and loyalty toward each other and toward ourselves. We had hot desire, tongue-dangling, nipple-aching, cunt-surging desire that seemed to start as a hunger in our blood, a pulse pain in our hearts. And what was it for? What was it for? What were we going to do with it? That was our question.
I love it.
Wow, I took a shower. That was just amazing.
I mean, you're a poet and you're writing prose, but you're still writing poetry.
But
it was
I just wanted to catch the whole thing, you know.
But
and it was teaching me about it. Yes, because that's it. That's when it gets repressed, that's what splits people away from each other.
But also the fact there was no imagery in the media. There were no images of lesbians on TV or in the movies. I mean, a few that were mostly negative. So when you had a dance or, a critical mass of women and you realized the lie, just as Judy's saying, the lie that to be a lesbian is ugly, the delight in finding that intense beauty and every single face was someone you wanted to know and possibly seduce or be seduced by, which was a way of loving yourself, but also a way of loving the culture, and it all got mixed together on a giant palette.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly
and that extended itself, too, because when you take it to the level of the festivals, which is what Judy described, and then taken to the 10th power, because you just have more and more and more. And Bonnie, you describe how women felt a sense of homecoming as they arrive at the festivals, and you have many eloquent testimonies to that.
Well,
and to the co-creation of all of what the festivals were about.
Well, I think that there's a couple of things. In my first book, Eden Built by Eves, I quote a woman who said, you went down a long road and then a longer road and then a dusty road and then a different road, and at the very end of all those roads, there was a woman with no shirt on. That is what I had heard about and what I had come to see. And for some, it was the journey to see the possibility of that very specific liberation that somebody else wore so casually, like, yeah, exactly, of course you get to do that. And then for others, it wasn't seeing just the one topless person as your sort of image of liberation, but encountering, hundreds and thousands of women from other countries. And, I mentioned just to meet a dyke with a New Zealand accent or someone driving in with an Alaska license plate, or to see all of the women at the Michigan Festival who stood up during the international welcome and spoke in different languages, including indigenous, Native American languages. For many women, that showed the global range of lesbian beauty, and they were just wondering if they would run into someone from their own town. And that, I saw so many women just cry, and many women wrote in a blank book I passed around what made them cry. Was it seeing children so free and relaxed, or was it seeing old women walking around with mastectomy scars with a tattoo over them or not? And for others, it was seeing, sign language interpretation for the first time, or something else that might be
bearded women.
Yeah, bearded women, women with disabilities, not just participating, but being in charge of war crews. And all of that, the relationships that I had over time included a couple of sign language interpreters, and I became very attuned to what was going on with deaf culture at a music festival, which many people would not think of going together. But it was all about creating accessibility so that everyone can come in and, see how cool women are,
Yes, exactly. Accessibility, that was just such a big factor at Michigan. I remember going there and being so astounded to see what they had done by taking rugs and turning them upside down and making wheelchair accessible paths all through the woods.
I was just going to mention that. Thank you, because somebody else would think that was strictly my own fantasy. But when I tell people that for 30 years I spent 2 weeks out of 52 living in a tent, and that the first 2 days of those 2 weeks every year began with nailing moldy carpeting into the woods, and that this is my life, and why? Well, so that a woman with a cane or a woman with a stroller can come into those woods and not stumble. And, and then we'd pull up all those nails at the end and roll it up and put it away again. And, I kept one of those rusty nails out of sheer, love of the labor. And, the work crews were a culture of their own where you would also get to know people while you're doing the work. Those are all subcultures of subcultures of subcultures. For every festival there was slang and insider jokes and language about what had to be done, and then there were stories of hilarious mishaps with the toilets or the stage collapsing or whatever. And the concern that I have in our era is that because of the criticism that's been lobbed at Michigan specifically, people have failed to investigate any of the other festivals as well, which are very different and have their own issues and successes in politics. And something like the National Women's Music Festival, which is well past 40 years and still going on, is never treated as a serious institution or as proof of lesbian cultural success. It's just ignored. And likewise, CampFest and Sister Fire and all of the others, which I increasingly am seeing as a real journalistic laziness in the queer community, that somebody says Michigan's bad, therefore you get to ignore everything that's under the umbrella of festival culture. You don't investigate anything else. You just stop right there. And that's what's creating erasure and loss of information, really, that should be passed very lovingly to the next generation. Yeah, and credit.
Because, really, it's a bias. It's just women. It's just what women do. So then there's this unconscious feeling that it can be dismissed. It doesn't count.
That has changed, and it has it's sort of morphed in different ways. In the beginning, there was a lot of jeering at, nothing important is happening if there isn't a man present. It sort of returned to that. But my natural disposition is cheerful. I can't just be, angry and disgusted that there's so much backlash against very recent lesbian feminist culture. I hate pain. I don't like feeling bad. I don't do well with being depressed or angry. So I simply jump right back into getting all of this documented as fast as hell. And my modus operandi right now is to work with every curator and archivist in the country and get festival archives into the Smithsonian, into the Library of Congress, into the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, into the Sophia Smith archives at Smith. Just get them in there and make them safe. And no time to sit around and be sad, although I certainly have opinions about that, about the disrespect for the culture. I want it permanently archived, and if we're going to be dinosaurs, I want those bones labeled accurately. And I really come to think of myself as kind of a bone labeler. This is a Stegosaurus dike. It is not a Brontosaurus dike. And, I'll be your little archaeologist scientist to make sure future generations understand that when they dig us up, as they inevitably will, in a pendulum swing of about 15 years. We have to take all our vitamins and be around for that conversation.
Yeah, right on. And for the next
you can
portal.
do that.
But, that brings to mind something that you wrote, that you said that feminist scholars are increasingly ambivalent about whether women-only spaces were ever appropriate or progressive. And, so I want to ask you, why is it controversial for a woman-defined culture to exist, since it has been prohibited across patriarchal history?
Well, it's very frustrating to me that it's increasingly becoming impossible and impermissible to be moral as a lesbian subject. The identity is being turned into a hate crime because it's so specific. If you have the specificity of a lesbian life is no longer this glorious autonomous thing, it's framed in terms of who it excludes and therefore oppresses. We're back to if you don't sleep with men, you're immoral. And I think that there's always been people who want to judge lesbian culture and who want to see women in it as unattractive. But I think that it surprised me. I was really unprepared for people who position themselves as gender warriors to be so hostile to lesbian existence. Because the training that we all had, at places like Michigan, included you work with your allies, but even within a progressive space, you have affinity groups that might be separatist. You all go to a festival, but you have deaf women's space and women of color space and space for women who are grieving their mothers. And if that doesn't apply to you, you don't go in there, and that doesn't mean they don't like you. It just means that's time for them to gather with their specificity. And I think lesbian specificity is what's under attack right now. And there has to be a really strong feeling about the power of the lesbian subject for there to be this much backlash suddenly coming up like 10 minutes after we win marriage rights. It's like, thank you for getting us rights, now vanish. We'll, replace you with something else. I don't know. It's difficult to talk about. There's a lot of deplatforming of women who speak out. There's a lot of cruelty within academia, and now I'm very protective of how I, narrate my political views or my own PR for my writing and so forth because of so much name-calling, frankly, against lesbians.
Well, it seems to me that one of the things is that people feel threatened at the idea that gender identity is not the end of the story, that sex oppression is still a reality.
Yeah.
And, this has been a large part of the whole lesbian feminist story, was because we faced discrimination, not only, gay women's liberation or under whatever names, as lesbians, as homosexuals, right? But also on the basis of being born and raised as females in a deeply woman-hating culture, and that leads to different needs and different realities in different political objectives. That right. Naming, to name that specifically is considered by some people a threat to the project of gender identity.
Yeah.
Well, I think that also there's a rollback of women's rights that's happening out of the religious right, and lesbians we're not in a vacuum. I think that these festivals and so on were places that a lot of cultural workers were using to replenish themselves once a year, and then to go back into the fray.
Yeah.
In their health centers, at their Planned Parenthood jobs, in their social work, in their development of psychology and pushing in new directions, and they would get exhausted and then replenish themselves, in the power places. But the lesbian is the central core of feminism. I was convinced that that's true.
Yes.
I saw that there were groups of women sharing stories in their living rooms, and then once a year there would be a parade. But there was not a mass women's movement until there was a lesbian movement, and that lesbian movement turned its attention to women at large. So these health centers were not about lesbian health specifically. They were about women's health. And the bookstore was not for lesbians only. It was for women in general to educate themselves, and so on and so on and so on. So the rights of mothers, the being against rape, being against all kinds of things that didn't actually happen so much to lesbians as it did to heterosexual women, but became the object of a great deal of activist attention from these dyke warriors who were in behalf of women. So that's women at large being under attack from the right in every direction we can imagine, to have lesbians also be dismantled is, I don't think, not incidental. I think that it all goes together.
It is part of the backlash.
Yeah.
It is part of the backlash. And, that's what's interesting to me is that there was this attempt in feminist academia to somehow make a claim that, I lost my place there, that lesbians were oppressed by the women's movement, that feminism was somehow oppressive to lesbian. And although Rita Mae Brown and others had their hard time with Now here and there, what I remember is that lesbians were the leaders, were founding battered women's shelters and rape crisis centers, and you could just name every
bookstores and
publishing houses, the bookstores, the festivals, and on and on and on.
And
so that seems to me like a fundamental lie about the actual contribution of lesbians, and this is not the first time around, because in the earlier portal, as Lillian Fatterman has documented, To Believe in Women, her book, she documents how lesbian couples were at the foundational leading edge also of the first wave.
Yeah. And
so it's a thing.
It's that whole list of the, did you know that this person was gay kind of thing. That was very exciting to me when people started, doing research, sharing who had really been a lesbian all along, and more celebrities certainly coming out, but also claiming women of the past until you realized exactly which dynamic personalities you had in your corner, and it's a gigantic list. But that is certainly not something that is taught to school kids now, how lesbians shaped America or shaped institutions or invented things. That's becomes, again, as women's studies was, a specialized area of research that you're allowed to be exposed to once you turn 18 and go to college, which not everyone does. It's held away until you're in a special status to get your inheritance, as it were.
Yeah, and that's something also that, go ahead, Judy.
No, go ahead. You go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to go from there into, Bonnie had this great critique in her book of the elitism of postmodern academic theory.
Yes.
And this demand, which is still around, that women have to learn this jargon in order to talk about our lives and our realities. And
I have to credit,
I love.
Okay, go ahead. You can read it. I don't have the book.
It alienated and remarginalized those who, while well-versed in local community building and grassroots political experience, did not speak the rarefied ivory tower English.
Yeah, and a really, thank you, a really big credit has to go to Barbara Christian, an African-American writer who wrote an article, The Race for Theory, which had a huge impact on me, and she pointed out the degree to which theoretical writing became an important resume builder exactly at the moment that, more women of color were finally getting into the universities, and we were finally able to see books by Alice Walker and Audre Lorde on a syllabus. And, she made a very important critique about moving the bar even more away from working class lesbians, feminists, women of color, because you had scholars who were basically writing for each other, who were influenced by a certain set of books. And in the earlier
all by white men.
Yeah, all by white men. And earlier in women's studies, a lot of the titles of classes were about things like, grassroots government and women's health, and people with practical experience who had done community work or, had basically done voter registration, let's say. So much of feminism came from, civil rights activism and women who had been involved in, local community building, had tremendous cred. Yeah, labor, unions, and it all kind of vanished. People who had never worked a day being in charge of what was received knowledge. And that had a great silencing, I felt, of the kind of freeing lesbian cultural writing and poetry and so forth that we started talking about in the beginning. I'm mindful I have to exit this conversation in about 3 minutes.
Yeah, okay, well, so Max, maybe you could wrap us up for the recess that and we can take this up in a second version of the podcast.
Yeah. Okay, well, I just wanted to ask each of you because, each of those books showed me many connections that I had not made of things sometimes that I was present at, but things I didn't know, like the genesis of Olivia Records that was sparked by Chris Williamson, or things women I know accomplished that I didn't know about. And so I wanted to ask you each what were some of the discoveries or realizations that you made while writing these books that might have surprised you.
Yeah. Well, I think I've already talked about a couple of them. So, Bonnie, why don't you?
Well, I was making a long list of lesbian actors. I was delighted to find that the American with Disabilities Act was written by a Jewish lesbian, Chai Feldblum. I found a whole lot of the history of festivals began with independent women's radio, which has made me interested in looking more and more at how lesbian radio shows shaped culture. I'm really interested in the way that once women's music was available on cassettes and it became a product you could own, that transformed a lesbian household or even a lesbian car into a private concert space, and you could take or import the feeling of being in that lesbian crowd, and you could have it in your personal space, and that permitted women year-round to have that sustaining, battery recharging feeling that you might only get at a festival. You could relive those concerts by having them on tape, but it also was a way of taking part in the culture that nobody knew about if you were closeted or had a, homophobic boss. Nobody had to know that you were driving across town, listening to Alex Dobkin on tape, as opposed to somebody seeing you at a pride parade. So I became very taken with the way that the simple technology of reproducing lesbian music, just like getting lesbian books or Judy's books and poetry into the hands of somebody like me, could transform lives.
Yes, that seems like a good place to end. That's what we were doing. We were transforming women's lives as we were being transformed by the movement.
What a pleasure to talk with you. I'm so happy right now.
Yes, I am too. I'm really enjoying this a lot. I think that it's a wonderful conversation.
To be continued.
To be continued. Thank you all very, very much. Judy Grahn, Bonnie Morris, and Max Dashu. So much richness and in the remembering and so many forgotten spaces that you've all filled in. So thank you for sharing and for shining your light on lesbian culture in such open-hearted ways. I think that this talk and future talks on the subject are just a wonderful gift of love that you all are giving to all of our generations of lesbians. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you
Jenny.
all.
I just got disconnected again in case you didn't figure it out.
Oh, okay. Well, welcome back. And I just want to give out some links so that you can, who are listening in, can find out more about these women and their ongoing work. Please check out their websites, judygrahn.org, bonniejmorris.com, and Max Dashu's suppressedhistoriesarchives.net. And thank you once again as we say goodbye to our guests. Goodbye, Judy Grahn. Thank you always.
Thank you, Jenny. Thanks for everything you're doing.
And thank you, Max Dashu. Bye-bye for now, and thank you for doing such a wonderful job of moderating the talk and facilitating everybody. And Bonnie Morris, thank you, and bye for now, and thank you for being the first to say yes to creating this podcast.
Oh, big love to you.
All right. This podcast is available free at greenlesbian.com, where you will find books by these wonderful women, as well as other fair trade and green products made by lesbians. Thank you all for listening, and keep an eye out for follow-up talks. Bye for now.